Good everyone. I hope you guys have an amazing day. So what I'll do today, I will talk about the data governance and stewardship, which is very important, right? You might have heard about data governance and you might have heard about the data stewardship, right? Now, in simple terms, right, I will tell you what both of these means, and also give you some of the practical examples uh, of these two things, right? Because from my experience, so data governance usually, if you talk about data governance, right, in a simple term, it's a framework. It deals with a framework which often talks about this. The frame. It is a framework which defines the standards and policies for managing organization data asset, right? Um, Whereas the stewardship is a practical implementation of these policies and standards, right? Or in simple terms, data stewardship deals with the data lifecycle, which means from managing the data, secure usage of the data, and the right usage of the data. It looks after all of this stuff, right? Now, the data governance and the data stewardship varies from companies to companies, right? But what we're going to look at it, we're just going to look at, excuse me, overview of these things, right? Like for instance, uh, the place where I work, right? We do have data governance in place, right? The data governance usually talks about, um, where an architect have to present a data model or the way you can handle the data. Like for instance, even if you're trying to do a field change, um, so that could be um, one of the things. My apologies if you're hearing a dog yapping. It's just my neighbor's dog, right? Don't know why it's yapping since morning. Apologies for that. Um, so so when you talk about uh, so sorry, I digress. So when you try to bring a paper to the data governance, usually when we look at it, data model get covered, why you wanted to introduce new fields, uh, even the data duplications, everything that needs to be associated with in terms of data migration, and even the user experience, right? Because to be honest, if you're presenting a user with a screen or interface and ask them to capture data, and if the field names or labels are not properly defined, then there is a very likely possibility that the user might miss or might enter incorrect information, right? That leads to a data quality issue. So these are the kind of things which often comes under governance, right? And it's very important, right? People um, um, often think it's not really important, but it costs companies a lot of money, right? Imagine you have a faulty data, right? Faulty data leads to a faulty forecasting, and we can impact the company's profit, right? It can even impact to that level. And you might have difficulty with the data segmentation, right? If you have incorrect information all over the place, how are you going to segment your data, right? So all these things are very important. That's why data governance and stewardship is very important. Um, so if you look at this figure, I mean, this is the Salesforce documentation, right? So I'm covering from a Salesforce documentation. So the 700 billion a year in potential sales is lost due to bad data. So data is, if these days everyone talks about artificial intelligence, right? So for AI to function properly, you need to have the right data because in what is AI, right? Or what is machine learning in simple terms, right? You collect the data, then you want to figure out what the data is about, and you build a motivation around what you can do with the data to come up with the best hypothesis. Then you choose an algorithm, you run an algorithm, and then you test your algorithm so that it can be used for predicting whatever you wanted to predict. Say your future company forecast, sales forecast, or whatever, right? Or if that person is having a cancer or no cancer, right? Oh, different kind of model. Sorry, I'm just giving an example, right? If your data is bad, right, then the algorithm will obviously perform bad. So that's why it's very important to have a the right data. So given the fact the Salesforce is aggressively pushing for AI stuff, right? So it's very important that you have a data governance in place. Now, from a Salesforce perspective, right, it talks about establishing rules and policies. So like uh, the definition which I give you is more or less the same. right? And the stewardship is a practical implementation of what the frameworks we have. So now, there are a few things you need to understand from a data governance and stewardship perspective. The first of all, it's very important to understand the state of data. Obviously, if you wanted to start a data governance, pretty good. Uh, what happens is that most of the time, the business don't have data governance in place. They have a simple architecture governance, which pretty much covers everything, right? Which is okay if that solves your need, right? But sometimes what happens, you might have a governance and you might seek to start another governance, talks mostly about the data, right? And before you do that, there are certain things you need to consider, which will help you to achieve your outcome and to have a better governance in place. First important thing is to access the state of your data. Obviously, your data is your company asset. So you need to understand the challenges, what you have in place, what are the limitations with the current data. Do you suffer with duplication? The most likely you do, because if you are not careful with the data, a lot of the companies do have duplication. I've seen almost every place I work, right? There is often a scenario where you will experience a data which looks replica of the data. For instance, um, John Doyle was represented like in five different places in for customer, right? So that's kind of a data duplication, right? Yes, you can say we have data cloud, we can do this and that, right? I just don't want it to get into data cloud at this stage. So it's very important to access the state of data, right? So that's one thing. Now, when you talk about the state of the data, right? Sorry, accessing the data. So the few things you have to understand: who is using your customer data, right? So what happens is that if you're using Salesforce, right? Because let's talk about Salesforce. You can talk about any of the technology. It doesn't matter, right? The principles also true. So you might be collecting customer information. So you wanted to understand who's using that information and what's the purpose of that data and how they're using the information, and are they using reports or are they querying the data, and what's the use of the data, right? Because that's where the policies like GDPR and everything comes in the picture, right? You shouldn't be using your customer data beyond what it's captured for, right? So all of these factors very important to consider. And what's the business need for the data, right? Like for instance, you capture customer data, and you have a specific business need. Like for instance, you wanted to pay a discount to a customer, so you might have to capture the data. So okay, so once you pay the discount, are you going to retain the data, or what's the business need beyond that, right? So you need to factor that. And if your organization says, "Oh, look, I want the data to stay in our system for let's say a few years," sure, that's a company policy. You need to communicate that, right? So and you need to document those information, right? And and which data is used the most, right? Obviously, you must be capturing PI information. That's personal information. Do you need that information all the time? Or along with the PI, you might capture other stuff. So you just need to ask how often this data is getting used, right? Or let's say, let's forget about that, right? How often the data is getting updated, right? For instance, a customer might have a first name, last name, date of birth. That obviously won't change, but the customer phone number could change. The address might change. So if the last updated date shows like 2012, so that's kind of shows that the data is not updated. So that is a data issue, right? Customer might have moved on to a different place. Or most likely the addresses might change, right? It may or may not change, right? But most likely I've seen the address do get changed, or email address get changed, phone number get changed. So you need to make sure that if that data is getting used constantly, and that is not updated, then there is a problem. So there is a data issue there. Um, so that's all the measuring the data quality. So this is very important metrics when you are looking at before you start the data governance, like age, like I said, when the data has been modified, completeness, is your data is complete, usage, time since the data has been used, accuracy of the data, consistency, and duplication, right? So that's one of the things I mentioned before I start this video, right? Uh, where I mentioned it's very important as a part of governance. You talk about the data capture from the user side, right? And that's why I mentioned to have an interface with the proper field name, proper labels, help text, even help text, right? Which is very important because what happens is if you present a user with an interface and ask them to enter the information, right? And if they're not pretty sure, right, most likely they will skip it. And another thing, if you think that information is mandatory, you need to make the field mandatory, right, or required. If you talk in terms of Salesforce, if you don't, then user might say, okay, why do I bother, right? So what happens if in such scenarios you won't be getting proper information or an accurate uh, representation of that data set? And when that happens, you might end up in having a lots of data set in place with incorrect information, and that's not really good. So before you start a data governance, it's very important that you factor these things, right? To measure the state of your data, because your data is a business asset, and data can lead to a lot of predictions, and even it can be used for forecasting, even it can be used for building LLMs. So to do that, you need to have a data in a proper state, right? So um, develop your governance plan, right? So because I've been a part of governance, I have introduced a governance. Like for instance, I run architecture governance. So I don't run data governance, but I run the architecture governance. So before I started doing any of this stuff, right, I have to plan for it, what exactly I'm trying to achieve it, and who are the audience I need to bring into the governance, and what are the contents I wanted to cover, right? Oh, and what are the voting rights? How does the voting rights look like? Who are, uh, the people I need to give voting rights to? So in data, when it comes to data governance, right? So you need to define as a part of governance the data definitions, the data standards, and the roles and ownership. Who will own part of data? Like for instance, who will own the data model? Who will own data migration stuff, right? Who will own the quality side of things, right? um, and who will own the enterprise data model? So that kind of questions you need to answer and define within the data governance. It's very important. And also the security is very important, right? Who will have access to the specific data? Because security is extremely important when you are giving access to your business data to somebody, right? And always you have to make sure you're giving authorized access to the right person. And if you do not have security protocols or security controls in place, it's most likely what happens, you will end up in exposing a critical, business critical data to a person who's not supposed to be having access. So that's why it's very important. You should factor that. And the quality control process, right? To make sure you do not have the duplications and you're capturing the right information for the date of birth. You're actually capturing the date of birth. And what that means is that if I ask someone to enter a date of birth, they should not say 2025, right? That's a stupid information, right? If you're capturing an information from an adult and say he's born today, so that's actually incorrect data. So you got to make sure you have all those rules and checks in place. At times, I understand it's very difficult to do that, but at least you can build a fairly decent rules. Yep. And similar to, your address, you should not put XYZ, right? You should be using lookups and Google finders and all kind of stuff, right? To makes it easier. And also where pick lists are required, you should give pick list, and it should be it should be a pick list where the user can't change it, um, right? So that kind of stuff. And implement your governance plan, right? You depends how you wanted to do it, right? Like in my case, I create a Confluent page, I share with the right stakeholder, I got the buying, and I organized, which day in a month I wanted to host, and I invited the right audience to it, and I sent out an agenda. Right, so this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to endorse. These are the voting rights. These are the papers we're going to, and how uh, often a person has to submit a paper, like in our case, is once in a month, and how do you socialize it, and the channel you use it, all kind of stuff, right? So it is very important to have the data governance, right? So and internally sourced, and yeah, one of the things I often wanted to mention, right? When you're talking about the Salesforce, right, data governance, it might happen that you may be consuming data from external source. So you might have to bring an architect from different products, right? Maybe, let's say you're talking about Oracle, for instance, right? If you are consuming the data from Oracle, you might have to bring an Oracle architect to your governance to to have their say, right? To have their opinion on it. Maybe you might be using the data in a different way, and the Oracle architects might have an objection to it. So you need to make sure you have a right list of attendees, right? And who you wanted to give the data voting rights. Obviously, if you're presenting a paper, you shouldn't be having a voting right, right? You won't be giving voting rights to yourself if you're presenting a paper. So you have to factor all those things into consideration. So um, yeah, so that's the kind of things I often look for: data governance and data stewardship, right? Because, like I said, right, you can make it very simple, or you can complicate it. If you do not have data governance in place, I would say start simple. Talk to the respective stakeholders to say, look, this is what um, we're planning to do, right? Because obviously, data is a big thing, and you need to sit with your designers and developers to say, and even the quality testers and managers, product managers, whoever it is, right? I mean, usually not product managers, because most of them don't have much idea, to be honest, how the data works. But usually designers and maybe the test lead and all, they will tell you. Also, the business users, right, who actually uses the data, so they will tell you the real data problem and data challenge, right? So work with them, and based on that, formulate a plan. Maybe write it down on a Confluent page. Socialize with the right people to say, look, these are the problems we have. So and you think it's a right thing to do to initiate a governance. And these are the audience. These are the architects. These are the data scientists or you wanted to bring it to the team. And these are the these are the measuring points you want to measure, key metrics you're going to look for. For instance, like I said, um, I when I if I let's say if I want to start a governance, right, I will write down on a Confluent page. I will look for these other things, right? Data model, field changes, which is obviously part of data model, user interface changes with respect to data capture, any kind of integration with external systems, right? Obviously, it's a data flow. Yes, integration needs to get involved as well, but there is a data flow happens, right? Data duplication, any kind of the page layout change, making any field mandatory, uh, renaming an API name, renaming a field name, adding new content to the pick list. These are the things needs to go to data governance, right? Because you are making a data change, like I said, and will have potential impact, with respect to a business process, right? So, and then you circulate your governance plan and get it endorsed, and then you start your governance once a month or once a fortnight, whichever way you wanted to do it. Start simple, and yeah, and then you can extend it based on your requirement, right? That's how I often recommend. I rather prefer, a business to have a simple data governance board rather than not having it all, right? Because what normally people do, they overcomplicate it. So just think about what I said, right? Because I chair architecture governance, so I'm telling from experience. Um, because obviously, I work as a Salesforce architect in one of the biggest government agencies of New Zealand. So, um, government agency in New Zealand. So, yeah. So that's being said, I hope you enjoyed the session. My apologies, it's all theory, but I hope you learned something and got some insight from my experience, right? Like I said, if you do not have data governance, think about it if you need one, right? And most likely you do. So, yep. That being said, I hope you guys have an amazing Saturday. Adios.